The cruelest mistake a king can make is believing that tomorrow will always give him another chance. Rosalie Hawthorne woke with the taste of winter still lingering on her tongue, her heart pounding against her ribs as though it had outrun death itself. For one impossible breath she expected to see the endless grey battlefield where the Lycan War had swallowed thousands, the smoke drifting across broken banners, and the lonely hill where she had taken her final breath with no one beside her. Instead, soft morning light spilled through the narrow window of her modest chamber inside the royal palace. The scent of fresh linen replaced the bitter scent of ash. A robin sang somewhere beyond the stone walls. Her hands trembled as she stared at them. They were unscarred. Young again. Alive. The calendar hanging beside her bed confirmed what her racing mind already feared. 3 days before the exile. 3 days before Alpha King Cale Ashford signed the decree that would cast her from the kingdom she had loved with every quiet piece of her heart. 3 days before the road that had once led her toward loneliness, sacrifice, and a death no one ever learned about. Rosalie closed her eyes, willing herself to breathe. She remembered everything. Every cold glance from the royal court. Every whispered accusation. Every moment she had believed loyalty would eventually be rewarded. Most of all, she remembered standing before the throne while Cale never once looked into her eyes as he pronounced the sentence that shattered her future. She had begged for nothing then. She had only hoped he would ask one question before believing the lies surrounding her. He never had. Somewhere deep inside, the quiet wolf that had once longed only for her destined mate stirred, but this time it did not reach toward him. It simply mourned what had been lost. A sharp knock sounded at her door. Lady Rosalie, a young servant called gently. His Majesty has requested the council gather before noon. In her first life, those words had filled her with nervous hope. She had rushed to prepare, believing another chance to prove herself had finally arrived. This time, a peaceful smile touched her lips. Instead, "Tell His Majesty I have already left," she whispered, though no one outside could hear the answer. She moved quickly through her tiny room, gathering only what truly belonged to her. A weathered leather satchel. A small journal filled with herbal remedies. A faded ribbon her mother had tied into her hair before illness claimed her years ago. Nothing else in the palace had ever truly been hers. As she stepped into the quiet corridor, servants hurried past carrying polished silver and embroidered banners. They smiled politely, unaware that history itself had begun to bend beneath invisible hands. Rosalie paused only once when she reached the grand staircase overlooking the throne hall below. Alpha King Cale stood surrounded by generals discussing rumors of unrest near the northern border. He looked exactly as memory had preserved him. Tall enough to command every room without speaking. Broad shoulders wrapped in black royal armor marked with the scratches of countless victories. A crimson cloak flowed behind him, while the jeweled sword of the Ashford bloodline rested against his side. His long black hair caught the morning light, and his sharp profile remained as impossibly striking as the day she had first met him. Once, simply seeing him had been enough to fill her with hope. Now she felt only quiet acceptance. As if sensing unseen eyes, Cale turned toward the balcony above. For the briefest heartbeat their gazes met across the great hall. His wolf stirred with an unfamiliar unease, though neither of them understood why. Before confusion could settle across his face, Rosalie lowered her eyes, turned away without a single word, and walked toward the palace gates. Behind her, the king watched longer than he intended. Ahead of her, the future no longer belonged to the past. Rosalie Hawthorne did not look back as the towering palace disappeared behind the rolling hills, although every step carried her farther from the life she had once believed was worth sacrificing everything to protect. Morning sunlight spread across the valley in ribbons of gold, warming the narrow road beneath her worn boots, yet the strange calm inside her heart felt colder than the breeze drifting through the pine trees. During her first life, this same road had been filled with tears and desperate questions. She had wondered how she could prove her innocence. She had imagined returning one day with the truth. Now she understood that some truths arrived far too late to save those who had trusted the wrong people. This time she would not spend another heartbeat begging anyone to believe her. A small farming village rested less than 15 miles south of the capital, and as Rosalie approached its weathered wooden fences, she immediately noticed details she had ignored in her previous life. Several children coughed as they carried buckets from the village well. A farmer wrapped a stained cloth around his wrist where an infected scrape had begun to swell. Wild moonroot, which only bloomed before unusual shifts in magical energy, grew thick along the nearby creek weeks earlier than it should have. Her memories stirred uneasily. None of this had happened before the Lycan War in her first life. The future had already begun to drift away from the path she remembered. Kneeling beside the creek, Rosalie carefully gathered the moonroot together with blue sage leaves and white bark, combining them into a simple healing mixture exactly as her mother had once taught her. By sunset, word quietly spread through the village that a traveling herbalist had eased fevers that local healers could not explain. She accepted nothing except a loaf of fresh bread and a small room inside an elderly widow's cottage. Peace, she realized, was worth far more than royal recognition. Far away inside the palace, Alpha King Cale Ashford stood alone before the wide windows of the council chamber long after his advisors had departed. Reports from the northern frontier covered the polished oak table, each describing strange sightings near abandoned fortresses and restless packs crossing old borders without explanation. Normally his sharp mind would have dissected every detail with flawless precision, yet today his thoughts kept returning to the silent woman who had walked away without asking for mercy, without defending herself, and without even speaking his name. An unfamiliar ache settled beneath his ribs. His wolf paced restlessly inside him, refusing every attempt to be calmed. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was the unbearable feeling that something precious had slipped through his grasp before he had even realized he possessed it. That night's sleep offered no comfort. Cale found himself standing within a dream that felt more real than memory itself. Thick gray mist rolled across an empty hillside while crimson banners fluttered beneath a sky hidden by storm clouds. Somewhere ahead, a young woman stood with her back turned toward him. Her golden brown hair danced in the cold wind, and although he could not see her face, grief pressed against his chest with such force that he struggled to breathe. He called out, but no sound left his lips. She slowly walked farther into the mist until only silence remained. Cale awoke before dawn, his pulse racing as though he had crossed miles instead of dreams. He pressed one hand against his chest, confused by the sharp emptiness lingering there. He had faced enemy kings without trembling, yet the disappearance of one quiet Omega unsettled him more than any battlefield ever had. Hundreds of miles from where destiny had once abandoned her, Rosalie opened her journal beneath the flickering light of a small candle and carefully wrote a single sentence across the first blank page. This life will not be spent waiting for someone else to choose my worth. As the ink dried, neither she nor the king realized that every choice they now made carried them farther from the future both of them had once unknowingly shared. The little farming village welcomed each sunrise with simple routines that had once seemed invisible to Rosalie Hawthorne but now felt more precious than royal ceremonies ever had. Children chased one another across open fields while bakers carried warm bread into the marketplace and elderly neighbors exchanged quiet greetings beneath weathered porches. It was an ordinary life, untouched by courtly ambition, and Rosalie guarded its peace with silent determination. Each morning she walked through the surrounding forests gathering herbs that only someone with years of experience would recognize. The villagers soon noticed that fevers faded more quickly after she arrived, aching joints troubled the elderly less, and exhausted travelers found renewed strength after drinking the teas she carefully prepared. She never accepted more than enough coins to buy fresh supplies because she remembered how greed had poisoned hearts long before the war ever reached the kingdom. Kindness, freely given, had become the future she chose to build. One afternoon a frightened mother rushed toward the cottage carrying her young son whose breathing had become shallow after wandering into a grove filled with strange silver pollen. Several neighbors gathered anxiously, believing an unfamiliar sickness had arrived. Rosalie immediately recognized the shimmering dust. In her previous life the same rare pollen had not appeared until months later, just before the first reports of unnatural creatures crossing forgotten mountain passes. She mixed moonroot with crushed blue sage, added cool spring water, and gently encouraged the frightened boy to drink. Within an hour his breathing steadied, color returned to his cheeks, and relieved tears filled his mother's eyes. The villagers began whispering that the quiet traveler possessed gifts beyond ordinary healing, but Rosalie only smiled and reminded them that nature often carried its own answers for those patient enough to listen. Even so, a question lingered in her thoughts. Why had the signs appeared so much earlier than before? Every memory she carried insisted the timeline had shifted again. Hundreds of miles away, Alpha King Cale Ashford studied fresh reports arriving from distant settlements. Refugees spoke of unusual illnesses spreading through isolated valleys and mysterious silver plants blooming far outside their normal season. One report caught his attention more than the others. A captain described a traveling herbalist who had restored hope to an entire village using knowledge no royal physician could explain. The captain had not written her name until the final line, almost as an afterthought. Rosalie Hawthorne. Cale stared at the parchment long after the messenger departed. Something deep inside him tightened with painful certainty. His wolf rose immediately, restless and alert, urging him toward a destination his mind refused to understand. Why did hearing her name feel less like discovering a stranger and more like remembering someone he had spent years searching for? That night another dream claimed him. He stood inside an endless forest where moonlight poured through towering pines. Ahead of him walked the same woman with golden brown hair, her simple blue-gray dress swaying gently with every step. This time she paused beside a quiet stream without turning around. Although he still could not see her face, he heard her voice carried softly by the wind. It was calm, almost forgiving, yet filled with a sadness older than either of them. Some wounds are created by silence, not cruelty. Before he could reach her, the forest dissolved into countless silver leaves carried away by the breeze. Cale awoke with those words echoing through his thoughts even though he had never heard that voice while awake. At sunrise he summoned Dorian Ashford, the only brother he trusted completely. Ride south, Cale instructed quietly. Find the herbalist called Rosalie Hawthorne. Do not frighten her. Do not order her home. I only wish to know if she is safe. Dorian studied his brother with quiet surprise because the king's expression carried neither royal command nor political calculation. It carried concern. Far beyond the palace walls, Rosalie closed her journal after recording another unexpected change in the world's unfolding future. She looked toward the distant northern mountains where dark clouds gathered earlier than memory allowed, and for the first time since awakening in her second life, she realized the coming war was no longer following the path she had once survived. It was becoming something entirely new. Prince Dorian Ashford left the capital before the morning mist had lifted from the castle walls, carrying no royal banner and wearing only the plain cloak of an ordinary traveler. His brother's unusual request lingered in his thoughts with every mile. Alpha King Cale Ashford had never asked anyone to quietly watch over a single citizen before. Especially not a woman who had willingly walked away from the palace without demanding justice or mercy. Something had changed inside the king, and Dorian intended to discover why. Days later he arrived at the peaceful farming village just as the afternoon sun painted the fields in warm shades of gold. Laughter drifted across the marketplace where neighbors exchanged vegetables, fresh bread, and stories from the surrounding countryside. It took very little time to hear the same name spoken again and again with quiet admiration. Rosalie Hawthorne. Not as an exile. Not as an omega to be pitied. Simply as the kind healer who always appeared before hope disappeared. Curious, Dorian followed the voices until he found her kneeling beside an elderly carpenter whose hands had become too stiff to finish repairing a broken wagon wheel. Rosalie carefully wrapped his fingers with a soothing herbal compress while patiently explaining simple exercises that would ease the pain over time. The old man smiled with grateful eyes, but Rosalie accepted only his sincere thanks before moving on to help another family. She carried herself with remarkable calm, never seeking praise and never mentioning the palace she had left behind. Dorian watched from a respectful distance, unable to reconcile the gentle woman before him with the troubling rumors that had once surrounded her at court. At that very moment, far inside the royal capital, another pair of eyes studied reports arriving from every corner of the kingdom. Vivian Blackmore sat beside the council chamber windows pretending to review diplomatic correspondence while secretly searching for any mention of Rosalie's name. In her previous plans, the quiet Omega had disappeared exactly as expected, forgotten by the court before the coming conflict reshaped the kingdom. Instead, scattered reports now described villages recovering from strange illnesses, travelers speaking of miraculous remedies, and ordinary people placing unexpected trust in the woman who should have vanished into obscurity. Vivian slowly folded the parchment, her composed smile never wavering, yet unease settled deep within her thoughts. The future no longer matched the path she had carefully prepared. Someone had changed the pattern long before she noticed it. Back in the village, Rosalie sensed the difference as well. Each sunrise revealed another small detail that had never existed during her first life. Birds migrated earlier. Rare herbs blossomed out of season. Merchants carried stories of abandoned settlements near the northern forests weeks before those places had once fallen silent. The world itself seemed to be rushing toward an unseen destination. That evening she climbed a grassy hill overlooking the valley and opened the weathered journal she had carried from the palace. Beneath the growing list of unexpected changes she added another careful observation. The war is no longer waiting for the kingdom. The kingdom is walking toward the war. As she closed the journal, footsteps approached quietly from behind. Dorian removed the hood covering his face before speaking with gentle respect. "Lady Rosalie, I have not come to command you home. I only came to ask one question." She turned calmly to face him, surprised but unafraid. "Is His Majesty well?" Dorian hesitated because the answer was far more complicated than he expected. After a long silence, he looked toward the fading horizon and answered honestly. "Ever since you left, the king has begun searching for something he cannot even name, and I believe he fears he has already lost it." Rosalie Hawthorne lowered her gaze for a quiet moment after hearing Dorian Ashford's words, but the familiar ache that would have once broken her heart never arrived. Instead, she felt only a gentle sadness for the man she had once loved with unwavering devotion. In another lifetime, she would have followed that single sentence back to the palace without hesitation, believing that hope still waited behind its towering gates. Now she understood that regret belonged to those who had chosen too late, while peace belonged to those brave enough to keep walking forward. She looked toward the distant horizon where evening sunlight rested upon the rolling hills and answered with calm honesty. "Then I hope His Majesty eventually finds what he is searching for." Dorian studied her carefully, surprised not by her words but by the serenity behind them. There was no bitterness in her voice, no desire for revenge, and no hidden expectation that the king would come to rescue her. The woman standing before him had already rescued herself. Before he could speak again, hurried footsteps echoed across the village square. A pair of exhausted travelers arrived with frightened expressions, explaining that several families from a settlement nearly 20 miles north had become weak after drinking from a mountain spring that had suddenly turned silver beneath the moonlight. The description immediately unsettled Rosalie. Her memories tightened around her heart. That mysterious spring had not changed until many months later in her previous life, after the first great wave of unrest reached the kingdom. Without hesitation she gathered her satchel, carefully filling it with dried herbs, clean bandages, and handwritten remedies. Dorian instinctively stepped forward. "Allow me to accompany you." Rosalie considered his offer for only a moment before nodding. "If you come as a traveler, not as a prince." A faint smile crossed Dorian's face. "Agreed." They departed before sunrise, following narrow forest trails as cool morning air drifted through towering pine trees. Along the journey Rosalie noticed more impossible changes. Wildflowers that normally bloomed in late summer already covered the hillsides. Birds suddenly abandoned entire groves without warning. Even the forest itself felt as though it were quietly holding its breath. Every unfamiliar sign confirmed the same unsettling truth. The future was rewriting itself faster than she could predict. Back inside the royal palace, Cale Ashford found no comfort despite surrounding himself with endless council meetings and military reports. Every evening his wolf grew more restless, refusing to settle no matter how much work occupied the king's attention. The dreams returned with increasing clarity. This time the mysterious woman stood beside a quiet river beneath countless glowing stars. He finally caught a glimpse of her face before she turned away. It lasted only an instant, yet that single moment left him frozen after waking. golden brown hair. Gentle eyes filled with quiet sorrow. Rosalie. Her name escaped his lips before he fully opened his eyes. The realization sent a strange silence through the empty chamber. Why would his dreams remember someone his waking mind had barely noticed? Later that afternoon, Vivian Blackmore quietly entered the royal library searching through ancient records concerning forgotten bloodlines and legendary healers. Too many unexpected events now revolved around Rosalie Hawthorne. Too many villages recovered after she appeared. Too many reports described impossible knowledge that no ordinary herbalist should possess. Closing one weathered manuscript, Vivian felt the first genuine thread of concern she had experienced in years. If Rosalie continued changing the kingdom one village at a time, carefully crafted lies would eventually collapse beneath the weight of undeniable truth. Meanwhile, as the sun disappeared behind distant mountains, Rosalie and Dorian reached the edge of the northern settlement. The frightened villagers gathered around them in anxious silence before an elderly woman stepped forward holding a small wooden bowl filled with shimmering water drawn from the spring. Rosalie accepted it carefully, and the instant moonlight touched its surface, a faint silver glow reflected across her fingertips. A forgotten memory flashed through her mind with startling clarity. She had seen this light once before, not at the beginning of the war, but only hours before discovering the greatest secret hidden beneath the kingdom, a secret she had never lived long enough to reveal. Rosalie Hawthorne remained perfectly still as the silver light shimmered across the surface of the water, illuminating delicate patterns that only she seemed able to recognize. The villagers watched with quiet anticipation while Dorian Ashford noticed the sudden change in her expression. She was no longer simply examining a strange spring. She was remembering something the rest of them could not see. In her previous life she had stood beside this very water only once, guided here by a wounded messenger during the darkest days of the Lycan War. She had sensed the same silver glow then, but before she could uncover its meaning, the kingdom had already begun to collapse beneath fear, suspicion, and desperate choices. This time she refused to let history outrun her. She carefully dipped a clean piece of linen into the glowing spring, then added crushed moon root and white bark to a small clay bowl. Instead of mixing the herbs immediately, she waited. Slowly, the silver light faded from the water without changing the herbs at all. Relief softened her features. "The spring is not poisoned," she said gently. "It is warning us." Confused murmurs spread among the gathered villagers. Rosalie knelt beside the edge of the spring and pointed toward tiny silver crystals forming beneath the smooth stones. "Something deep beneath these mountains has awakened. The water is carrying that change before anything else can." Dorian listened carefully. Although he had never studied ancient healing traditions, he trusted the certainty in her voice. "Can it be stopped?" he asked. Rosalie hesitated because the truthful answer carried memories she had hoped never to revisit. "Perhaps. But only if we understand what is waking the land before fear spreads faster than the truth." The villagers followed every instruction she offered, drawing drinking water from a neighboring creek until the strange glow disappeared naturally. No one argued. No one questioned her judgment. Their trust was given freely, without titles or royal decrees. For the first time in either lifetime, Rosalie realized that genuine respect felt nothing like the fragile approval she had once sought inside the palace walls. Far away in the capital, unsettling reports arrived one after another. Northern patrols described abandoned watchtowers, frightened merchants spoke of unusual howls echoing through distant valleys after sunset, and scouts reported entire packs changing their migration routes for reasons no one could explain. Around the council table, generals argued over military strategy, but Cale Ashford found himself distracted by a different concern. Every report seemed connected by an invisible thread leading south, toward the villages where Rosalie had chosen to remain. His wolf paced restlessly, refusing food, refusing sleep, refusing peace. Late that evening Cale dismissed the council before anyone could object. Standing alone beneath the towering windows of the throne room, he removed the heavy crown from his head and stared into the darkness beyond the castle walls. Another fragment of memory slipped into his dreams even while awake. He saw gentle hands glowing beneath silver light. He heard the distant sound of flowing water. Then a voice whispered with heartbreaking clarity, You never asked why I stayed." The vision vanished almost instantly, leaving him shaken by emotions that did not belong to any memory he consciously possessed. At the same hour, Vivian Blackmore quietly welcomed General Gideon Mercer into her private chamber. Neither raised their voices. Neither spoke recklessly. "The villages trust her," Gideon observed after reviewing the newest reports. Vivian folded her hands calmly. "Then we make certain the kingdom fears what it does not understand before trust becomes loyalty." Their plan remained hidden behind carefully chosen words, but the first seeds of doubt had already begun to take shape. Outside the northern village, Rosalie closed her journal after recording every strange detail surrounding the Silver Spring. As she prepared to leave before dawn, a faint pulse of light rose from the distant mountains, visible only for a heartbeat before disappearing into the night sky. Her breathing slowed as another forgotten memory returned with painful clarity. The light did not mark the beginning of the coming war. It marked the moment an ancient power beneath the kingdom quietly opened its eyes once again. Rosalie Hawthorne could not take her eyes off the distant mountains long after the mysterious silver light had faded into the darkness. The memory it awakened refused to disappear. During her first life she had believed the light marked another strange omen lost beneath the endless tragedies of the Lycan War. Now she remembered what had happened only hours afterward. An elderly guardian had whispered a single forgotten truth before passing away, telling her that the mountains did not awaken because of the war. The war awakened because something beneath the mountains had answered the cries of a kingdom divided by fear instead of trust. She had dismissed those words then, believing grief had clouded the old man's mind. Now every change unfolding around her proved he had been trying to leave behind a warning. At dawn Rosalie and Dorian climbed a narrow trail leading toward an abandoned sanctuary hidden among towering cliffs. Time had weathered the stone walls, but delicate carvings of wolves surrounding a crescent moon remained untouched, as though protected by an invisible promise. Wild flowers covered the broken steps, and clear water flowed quietly through ancient channels carved into the rock centuries earlier. The peaceful silence felt sacred rather than forgotten. As Rosalie crossed the entrance, a gentle warmth spread through her fingertips. The strange sensation guided her toward a circular altar resting beneath an opening in the ceiling where sunlight poured directly onto smooth white stone. Without understanding why, she placed her hand upon its surface. At once faint silver patterns appeared beneath her palm, glowing like moonlight reflected across calm water. Dorian stepped back in astonishment, but Rosalie only closed her eyes as another fragment of memory returned. She remembered standing here once before, exhausted by war, while an elderly woman wearing the robes of an ancient healer looked upon her with tears of relief. "The moon healer bloodline has finally returned," the woman had whispered. Before Rosalie could ask another question, frightened soldiers had arrived carrying urgent news from the battlefield, and she had left without ever learning the truth. The memory ended there, unfinished once again. Slowly the silver light faded from the altar, leaving only silence behind. Dorian spoke carefully. "Rosalie, I have traveled across nearly every province in the kingdom. I have never witnessed anything like this." She looked down at her hand, still warmed by the fading glow. "Neither did I, until I remembered." Back inside the capital, Cale Ashford found himself abandoning every attempt to ignore the growing unease within his soul. The dreams had become too vivid to dismiss as imagination. He no longer saw only fragments. He saw Rosalie walking alone through snow while he remained helplessly out of reach. He heard himself calling her name with a desperation that echoed long after waking. Most troubling of all, he felt the unbearable certainty that he had once failed her in a way no king should ever fail someone who trusted him. Refusing to remain imprisoned by uncertainty, Cale entered the royal archives himself. Ancient records filled countless shelves, many untouched for generations. Hours passed before an aging historian carefully placed a weathered manuscript before the king. "Very few remember these legends anymore," the scholar explained softly. "They speak of the moon healers, guardians whose blood resonated with the land itself during times of great imbalance." Cale's pulse quickened as he turned another fragile page. An illustration depicted silver light flowing through healing hands beneath the same crescent moon carved inside the sanctuary Rosalie had just visited. Before he could study further, another report arrived from the northern provinces. It described an abandoned shrine where mysterious light had been witnessed again after centuries of silence. Far away, hidden among the quiet mountains, Rosalie gently closed her journal after writing only one sentence across the newest page. I was never meant to survive the first life merely to escape sorrow. I returned because the kingdom forgot the truth it was built upon. As the evening wind swept through the ancient sanctuary, neither she nor Kale realized that two separate paths, guided by forgotten memories and long-buried truths, were already leading them toward the same revelation that would change the fate of the kingdom forever. The road leading back toward the capital had never felt longer to Alpha King Kale Ashford than it did on the evening he closed the ancient manuscript with trembling hands. Every forgotten legend pointed toward the same impossible truth. The moon healers had never ruled kingdoms, commanded armies, or sought glory. They quietly preserved the balance between the land, the wolves, and the people, often unnoticed until the kingdom stood on the edge of ruin. As Kale stared into the fading light beyond the palace windows, one painful realization settled deeper than any wound he had ever carried. If Rosalie Hawthorne truly belonged to that forgotten bloodline, then the court had not merely rejected a loyal Omega. They had turned away the very person history had waited to protect. His wolf answered with a deep ache that no amount of reason could silence. Meanwhile, far beyond the palace walls, Rosalie and Dorian descended from the ancient sanctuary carrying more questions than answers. The valley below seemed unchanged, yet Rosalie noticed subtle signs that escaped everyone else. The silver wildflowers along the trail had begun blooming in perfect circles around old stones marked with faded moon symbols. Streams flowed with unusual clarity, and birds returned to forests they had abandoned only days before. The land itself appeared to respond to the awakening beneath the mountain, not with fear but with cautious hope. As they reached the village, anxious travelers arrived from neighboring settlements carrying troubling rumors. Several local leaders had begun warning their people to avoid Rosalie, claiming her strange abilities signaled dangerous magic rather than healing. No evidence supported the accusations, yet uncertainty spread quickly among those who had never met her. Rosalie listened quietly without defending herself. She recognized the pattern immediately. In her first life, lies had always appeared before the truth had enough time to stand on its own. Dorian's expression darkened with concern. He understood that such rumors rarely grew by accident. Somewhere, someone wanted fear to outrun trust. Inside the capital, Vivian Blackmore watched the kingdom respond exactly as she intended. She had never needed outrageous falsehoods. Gentle suggestions whispered into uncertain ears were often far more powerful. A healer surrounded by mysterious light. Ancient shrines awakening after centuries. Villages changing in ways no one understood. Fear would complete the story for her. Yet despite her carefully woven influence, one unexpected obstacle refused to disappear. Kale no longer ignored every report mentioning Rosalie. Instead, he demanded to read each one personally. His growing determination unsettled Vivian far more than the villagers' loyalty ever could. Before dawn the following morning, Kale made a decision that surprised the entire royal council. He removed the ceremonial cloak reserved for formal audiences and instead dressed in the practical black traveling armor he had not worn since his earliest campaigns across the northern frontier. General Gideon Mercer questioned the unusual choice, but Kale answered with calm certainty. There are answers waiting beyond these walls that no messenger can bring home. Without announcing a royal procession or issuing commands to summon Rosalie back, he chose to ride north with only a handful of trusted companions. He no longer wished to bring her before the throne. He intended to stand before her himself. At nearly the same hour, Rosalie stood beside the quiet spring once more, watching the silver glow ripple gently across the water. As she reached toward the surface, another forgotten memory unfolded with startling clarity. She remembered a voice she had not heard since her first life, soft yet filled with quiet authority. When the rightful healer returns, the king must choose humility before the kingdom can be healed. The words echoed through her heart as fresh hoofbeats carried across the distant valley. Looking toward the rising sun, Rosalie saw several riders approaching along the winding road, and although they remained too far away for faces to be recognized, something deep within her soul already knew that destiny had finally stopped chasing the past and had begun arriving at her doorstep instead. The riders slowed as they entered the quiet valley, allowing the peaceful sounds of the village to remain undisturbed. Alpha King Kale Ashford guided his horse to a gentle stop several yards away from the silver spring, his gaze fixed on the woman standing beneath the morning light. Rosalie Hawthorne looked exactly as she had appeared in his dreams, calm, graceful, and impossibly familiar. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The breeze carried the scent of pine and fresh water while the villagers quietly watched from a respectful distance, sensing that something far greater than an ordinary meeting was unfolding before them. Kale stepped down from his horse and removed the black gloves covering his hands. No royal herald announced his arrival. No soldier demanded obedience. He crossed the final few steps alone. "Rosalie," he said softly, speaking her name with a sincerity that surprised even himself. "I came because I owe you the truth, even if I do not yet understand all of it." She studied him with steady eyes. There was no anger within them, only the quiet strength of someone who had already survived disappointment. "The truth cannot change what already happened," she answered gently. "But it can change what happens next." Those words settled heavily upon Kale's heart. His wolf, restless for so many nights, finally grew still as though recognizing a path that had been hidden until this very moment. Before anyone could speak again, villagers gathered near the spring began pointing toward the water. Soft silver light spread across its surface before flowing outward through the nearby streams. The withered grass along the banks gradually returned to rich green, and delicate white flowers opened beneath the morning sun. An elderly woman stepped forward with tears shining in her eyes. "The land remembers her," she whispered. Rosalie instinctively reached toward the glowing water, and the same silver light gently surrounded her hand before fading into the earth itself. No force, no fear, and no destruction accompanied the miracle. Instead, warmth spread peacefully across the valley, carrying a sense of quiet renewal that every person present could feel. Dorian looked toward the ancient mountain peaks and finally understood the forgotten stories were never legends at all. They were memories waiting for someone worthy enough to awaken them again. At that same hour, a royal messenger arrived carrying sealed documents recovered from abandoned archives beneath the capital. The aging historian who had discovered them bowed respectfully before the king. "Your Majesty, these records were hidden generations ago." Kale carefully opened the oldest parchment. Inside rested the testimony of the last Moon Healer Guardian. Every page described the sacred duty of protecting the kingdom through compassion rather than fear. One final passage caused his hands to tremble. It revealed that the Moon Healer must always be protected by the crown, because when the kingdom rejected its healer, the balance between the wolves and the land would slowly begin to fail. Kale closed his eyes as every unexplained dream, every restless night, and every painful feeling finally formed a single heartbreaking truth. He had condemned the very person his throne had been sworn to protect. Without hesitation he turned toward the gathered villagers and lowered himself onto one knee before Rosalie. A stunned silence swept across the valley. Kings did not kneel lightly, yet Kale neither hesitated nor looked away. "Before my people and before the kingdom I serve," he said with unwavering humility, "I acknowledge that I failed to seek the truth before passing judgment. I cannot ask you to erase the past, and I will not ask for forgiveness you do not wish to give. I ask only for the chance to earn trust through my actions from this day forward." Rosalie remained silent as emotion quietly filled the faces surrounding them. Then she offered a small, peaceful smile, not as forgiveness already granted, but as hope no longer denied. "The kingdom can heal," she said. "But only if every life is valued before every title." Kale rose and publicly declared that every accusation against Rosalie Hawthorne would be investigated openly, that all citizens regardless of rank would receive equal protection under the crown, and that no future judgment would ever be passed without evidence and a fair hearing. In the days that followed, the truth behind the false accusations began emerging from forgotten records and conflicting testimonies, exposing the deception that had hidden within the court for far too long. Those responsible were stripped of their influence through lawful justice, while the kingdom embraced long overdue reforms that protected the vulnerable instead of overlooking them. Rosalie accepted neither wealth nor privilege beyond the freedom to continue serving where she believed she was needed most. Only after witnessing the king's unwavering commitment to change did she choose to stand beside him once again, not because destiny demanded it, but because it had become her own decision. As the silver light quietly spread across the valleys and forests, the kingdom discovered that its greatest victory had never been winning a war. It was learning that true strength began with humility, justice, and the courage to listen before it was too late.